Hey, everybody, and welcome back to Lunch with California Common Cause, our weekly conversation with democracy allies and our California Common Cause membership. We're streaming live on YouTube this week, a couple minutes after noon. We're working through our tech options with this. Our hope is to go live to you on some platform every week, Wednesdays at noon. Thanks for joining us. Thanks for being here. If you missed last week, our episode is on our YouTube channel. I started last week by sharing some reflections at the top of that episode about the anger and the pain of this moment in America. I had some thoughts about the role Common Cause can play in building a better democracy that values everyone, including Black lives and Black votes, but also our limits as an organization and the value of activism that is outside of what Common Cause can offer. We also talked about the California November 2020 election with Dr. Mindy Romero and all the things that we're doing in California to prepare for a November election that is safe and accessible. To hear all that, check out our last episode. It's on our YouTube page. I want to share a few more thoughts today to open before we bring on our guest, Keshia Morris, who works on census, redistricting, and mass incarceration at National Common Cause. In one way, this moment in which millions of people have taken to the streets fighting for racial justice and for policing reform has actually reaffirmed for me the value of structural democracy reform. And I know that may sound odd, and so what do I mean by that? It really shouldn't take what we have seen these last few weeks to pass common sense reform of policing practices, for example, or to align local budgets in a way that reflects what communities actually need and actually want. But the structures of power are so tilted towards the status quo and towards special interests and power players, like police unions, for example, that this is sometimes what it takes. We at Common Cause are trying to build a democracy that enables everyone to be able to enables everyone to be heard, and enables everyone to make change. So it doesn't take another nationwide explosion of anger and grief to get meaningful reform. And just by the way, thinking about Georgia yesterday with huge multi-hour lines in communities of color to vote in their primary and few to no lines in upper income white neighborhoods, how can anyone trust that they can use democracy to create change when those are the rules of the road for voting? When democratic systems feel so fundamentally unfair, of course people take to the streets, as they should. And sometimes the entrenchment of special interests is so deep that even taking to the streets by the millions doesn't matter. Look at gun control. There has been march after march after march on behalf of gun control. And it doesn't feel since Sandy Hook or even before, this country has made meaningful movement on gun control. So we're working to level the playing field. That's what I mean when I say this moment underscores for me the value of structural democracy reform. As boring as structural democracy reform might sound, we want to uproot systemic inequities and give everyone a chance at creating change without having to lead a once-in-a-generation nationwide mass mobilization in order to do it. But at the same time, we can't just sit back and say that the work we do already meets this moment. It doesn't, not fully. We must do self-reflection as an organization and push ourselves to do better. And at California Common Cause, we've started that process. Here's one thing we're thinking. We are an organization that is about holding power accountable and insisting on government transparency. But we have missed the fact that in many states and localities, law enforcement has created its own set of exemptions and carve-outs to shield itself from the sunshine and accountability that we as an organization would insist upon for every other governing body. When it comes to excessive force, community complaints against officers, abuses of power by law enforcement, we often know next to nothing. And that's something we should have been working to change all along. The fact that we haven't is a blind spot for us as an organization and a product of our privilege and our institutional whiteness. Going forward, California Common Cause is working to change that. We're going to engage on these issues in a way that is authentic to us and centered in the value and the expertise that we bring as an organization based on our multi-decade track record. But first and foremost, it's mostly a time for us to listen. Other organizations have been dedicated to that work for a really long time, and California Common Cause is late to that party. So we're going to listen, We're going to observe the leadership of others, and we're going to find a way to contribute in a way that is true and authentic to who we are. So I welcome your thoughts and your reflections on this moment and how it intersects with California Common Cause and our mission. Overall, of course, as I said last week, we're committed to building a democracy that includes everyone, and we've got a lot of work to do. With that, I want to welcome our guest, Keshia Morris, who is the Census and Mass Incarceration Project Manager at Common Cause. She's based in Washington, D.C. Keshia, thanks for joining us.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jonathan, for having me.
So, Keshia, you work on, among other things, census. So let's jump in on that topic. How are we doing with the 2020 census? Obviously, taking a nationwide count in the middle of a pandemic is incredibly difficult. Fill us in.
Absolutely. So the census is moving along, but we definitely could be doing a lot better than we're doing right now. Because of the COVID crisis, the Census Bureau has yet to start knocking on doors, obviously for good reason. We want to keep people safe. But right now, people have the option to self-respond. They can respond online at 2020census.gov. They can respond by phone, or they can respond by mail. Looking at the bigger picture, as I said, the Census Bureau seems to be doing pretty well. But when we dig a little bit deeper, we do see some disparities in the count. Right now, the census responses are at about 60.8% of the country responding, and that does actually meet where the Census Bureau thought they would be at this time. They estimated that about 60.5% of the country would self-respond on their own without having a door knocker come to their door. But if we do look at 2010, we do see that we are about 6 points below where we were in 2010. But again, the good news here is that because of the COVID crisis, the Census Bureau has extended door knocking operations until October 31st. So that means that we have time to ensure that all communities are counted in the census.
So just a moment ago, we were talking about inequities, structural inequities in government. And if those inequities are baked into census, given that census is sort of the basis for all of our governing going forward, if it's baked into the census, then we're going to see inequity sort of multiplied through all the other systems. So tell us a little bit more about the disparities between communities in terms of census response, in terms of different states, different regions, different communities answering at different rates.
Absolutely. So yes, there are many communities that have been historically undercounted in the census. People of color, particularly Black, Latino, and Native American communities in both rural and urban areas, not just urban areas, have been at risk of not being counted in the census. But we also know that renters and people that live in multifamily housing, single parent households, children under the age of 5 years old have also been historically missed in the census. So as you said, Jonathan, that amounts to unequal representation, not only along racial lines, but also along socioeconomic lines as well. We are seeing those trends resurface in 2020, especially for those that are below the poverty line. The average response rate across high poverty tracts is about 46.9%, and that is about 14 points lower than the national average. And unfortunately, that gap seems to be slowly widening as the census goes on.
Oh no.
Yeah. But I would encourage folks to take a look at CUNY's Hard to Count map. I believe we're going to put that link in the comment section so you can see how folks are responding to the census in your own communities. But just to give an example, Minnesota right now has the highest response rate of all the 50 states, with about 70.5% of the state responding. While if you look at California, the state's response rate is much lower at about 60.2%. And those numbers are just as of yesterday. And that disparity is likely because California is much more diverse than Minnesota is. California has more renters and folks that live in multifamily housing due to the high cost of housing in California. And because of the diversity, we also know that there are more folks in California with limited English proficiency. So although the census is, you can take it in about 60 different languages, how folks are being mailed the census, that letter or postcard with the unique ID only comes in English or Spanish, unfortunately. So if you get this and you don't have English or Spanish proficiency, you might not know what's coming to your door. So yeah, I'll stop there.
Yeah, language proficiency and the census is a huge issue. And in California, we have a ton of really great groups that are working to ensure language access in the census, but it's an uphill fight. NALEO is on that list. Asian Americans Advancing Justice is on that list. Advancement Project is on that list. Chinese for Affirmative Action is on that list. I just want to call out some groups that are working really hard on exactly that issue. So we said a second ago that census is sort of the basis for policymaking. If there are disparities in census response, what does that mean for funding and policy choices for the next decade?
Oh, well, that means a lot. And that is why so many folks are working towards getting a fair and accurate census count. Census data is used to make decisions on how power and money are shared in our society. So when communities of color and communities that are already experiencing poverty are undercounted, that means the resources and representation that they deserve goes to communities that are more privileged instead. Every year, the federal government spends about $1.5 trillion on healthcare, food, housing assistance programs, lunch programs, education. All of that money is guided by census data. And just a couple of examples. In 2016, California received about $55.4 billion from the federal government for Medicaid programs, $3.5 billion for Section 8 housing, $1.2 billion for student lunch programs, and so on, and totaling all about 15, it's such a big number, I can't even say it, $115 billion from programs guided by census data.
Right, so if California has a substantial undercount, we get less than our fair share of those billions and billions of dollars.
Right, absolutely.
Yeah. So what does Common Cause do to encourage an accurate count on census?
So we are active on a few fronts. We help utilize local knowledge and influence and resources to educate communities to promote the census locally through targeted outreach efforts. So for example, we serve on what's called complete count committees at the statewide and local levels. Those are committees that are usually formed by state and local government to help make decisions on what is needed locally to help ensure an accurate count and to ensure that each state and locality gets the money, power, and resources that they deserve. Another way that we are active is for advocating for funding for the 2020 census at the state and local levels. Last legislative session, we were able to pass millions of dollars for census, supplemental funds for census outreach in a number of states. We were super active in Illinois, Colorado, Rhode Island, and a few other states. And we also advocate for census funding on the federal level as well, including right now the passage of the HEROES Act, which is in Congress right now, that has important provisions for the success of the census. I would also encourage folks that are listening to join us in the campaign to get everyone counted. They can join our census action team. Folks on the action team have or can write postcards, send text messages, encouraging census participation for members of their community. They can join at commoncause.org/census-act. That's census ACT. Or you can help out by writing a letter to the editor, to your local newspaper. In just a few easy steps, that link is commoncause.org/census-LTE. We'll also put those in the chat as well.
That is awesome. They're so action-oriented, Keshia. Thank you. Really pointing people towards easy steps they can take to make a difference. You also work on redistricting. And of course, Common Cause is a nationwide leader on redistricting. Here in California, California Common Cause fought for the creation of the nation's first citizen-run independent redistricting commission, which is now a model for the rest of the country. And we're working now on the creation of the second independent citizen-run redistricting commission. So we have our hands full nationally and in California on redistricting. Census and redistricting are intimately connected, right? Can you share with our listeners how?
Absolutely. The short answer is it is absolutely connected. I mean, garbage in, garbage out. If you have census data that is not representative of our communities, we'll absolutely have bad data when we are redistricting our communities. Excuse me. But however, we do know that some bad actors have also figured this out, which is why we saw the Trump administration try to add a question on citizenship to the 2020 census to depress response rates. Thankfully, that question never made it to the 2020 census, but we still have some work to do to help communities gain trust in the census again.
It really felt like that citizenship question
Yeah.
weaponized the census. It was a way of suggesting to immigrant communities the census is going to be used to target you and your family. And then in reality, the data privacy controls around census data are so strong. I mean, they're basically the strongest data privacy controls anywhere in federal law. The Census Bureau cannot share your census response with law enforcement, with ICE, with the FBI, or whatever. It would be almost impossible, basically totally impossible, for the federal government to use your census response to track you or a family member down. But it certainly gave people the impression that the census could be used for that purpose, right? And it absolutely depressed response rates even after it was struck by the Supreme Court because it sowed so much distrust in the census. Our listeners probably remember a big fight at the Supreme Court a while back over something called Evanwell, and whether redistricting should count everybody as it has for decades, or if it just count US citizens. Can you tell us a little bit about that and whether it's still something we're confronting today?
Absolutely. So just to explain that, so the Supreme Court ruled in that case that it does not violate the law to count everyone when drawing district lines, as we have been doing for more than 100 years now. But the court did leave open if it's also constitutional to use another population basis, such as citizen voting age population when drawing district lines. So what does that mean? By law, electoral districts have to use the same number of people when drawing district lines. And state leaders draw those boundaries based off of total population. But partisan operatives have been trying to change how districts are drawn in a radical effort to undermine our democracy. They have been plotting to draw state and legislative and congressional district lines that exclude non-citizens and people under the age of 18 from representation. And that is a move that they believe would be advantageous for Republicans and non-Hispanic whites. I can't say this enough. This is an extremely dangerous and radical proposal that serves to wipe millions of people, including people of color and young people, from the representation that they deserve. And to be clear, this is not just some theory being proposed right now. This is actually being proposed in Missouri, where Republican legislators have voted to put this on the November ballot. Amendment 3 in Missouri seeks to do two things: eliminate non-citizens and minors from representation, and it also seeks to undo the will of Missourians that called for independent redistricting. So if folks would like to know more about this issue, I know it's kind of complicated, a little bit wonky, but it does have a huge impact for our democracy if this was to move forward. I would recommend folks going to and reading our report at commoncause.org/whitewashing. That explains more about this plot and how this data would harm our communities. Or if you would like to know more about what's going on in Missouri, you can also visit cleanmissouri.org.
I really love how action-oriented, Keshia, you are at all of it. I need to make sure I have links for every one of these going forward for every week, because if we had any links. I guess we had one link last week. We need more links. We need more action steps.
That's what it's about.
You mentioned Republicans and non-Hispanic whites. Yeah. And before anyone says, why are they being so partisan? This isn't a Democrat versus Republican issue. Let's be really clear that that's a direct quote from the files of the Republican redistricting operative, who was essentially the mastermind of all of their gerrymanders, right?
Absolutely. It was actually in a Common Cause lawsuit that we had in North Carolina that uncovered the files of, his name was actually Dr. Thomas Hoffler. He died in 2018, and we were able to uncover hundreds of thousands of files that he used to gerrymander districts. And also in one of those files, we saw that he was actually one of the masterminds behind putting a citizenship question on the census for this exact purpose of diminishing representation of people of color and bolstering representation for, in quotes, Republicans and non-Hispanic whites.
Yeah, and that was, when I was working in a previous organization over that citizenship fight, and lots of the community members we worked with were rightfully felt like the citizenship question was being asked so that law enforcement could target non-citizens or folks who are undocumented. And while I think it was intended to create that fear, the real intention was to alter the balance of power. It was to affect redistricting data to get a data set that folks could use from the census that counted only citizens of voting age, so that could then be used as a basis for population counts in redistricting, and fundamentally shift where power resides within states and between states. So anyway, Common Cause has been a leader on that fight, and I'm sure will continue to be one. I want to ask you just one more question about your work before we talk sort of a little bit more broadly about Common Cause's mission in this moment. You also work on prison gerrymandering. And while a lot of our listeners, I think, are probably very familiar with the terms redistricting, familiar with the term gerrymandering, people may be somewhat less familiar with the term prison gerrymandering. So what is that, and why does Common Cause work on it?
Yeah, so prison gerrymandering is like so many of the issues that we face today and that Common Cause works on. It's about an assault on fair representation. And for those that don't know what prison gerrymandering is the practice of counting incarcerated people at their prison location instead of their home communities. And this robs many communities of representation while bolstering representation for more rural, whiter communities where prisons are located. This may not seem like a big deal. And honestly, this is how we've been doing redistricting for a while. But when we have the problem of mass incarceration, and you now have 2.3 million people incarcerated in the US, it then becomes a big deal and excuse districts. And frankly, it's just not fair. People in prison in all but 2 states, Maine and Vermont, do not have the right to vote. But when the census comes around, rural communities definitely want their prison populations counted, because that means more money and more representation for them.
So
And yeah.
I'm sorry, no, go ahead.
No, go ahead. No, go ahead.
So if you have a small rural town of 20,000 people with an incarcerated population of 10,000 people, you've now got 50% more people to count for the census, which means 50% more resources, more services, more infrastructure, and so on.
Absolutely.
Even though those folks aren't actually members of that community, can't access those services and won't benefit from any of that federal funding.
Yeah, it is a large problem. But we do know that about actually 9 states have passed prison gerrymandering reform, including California. So in after 2021 redistricting, there will be about 30% of the country that does not have to suffer from prison gerrymandering.
Right.
We have a lot more to go.
Yeah, we have a lot more to go. In California, we strive to count incarcerated folks at their last known address so that they are counted in the communities they will return to after incarceration, instead of being counted where they're incarcerated. Yeah. Keshia, I wanted to just close by talking a little bit about this moment. Here at California Common Cause, we've been talking internally about how this moment makes us feel about working at Common Cause, about the mission of Common Cause, and staff have had a range of reactions. And my comments at the top of this, and if folks missed it because they joined late, we'll post this link, we'll keep this link on our YouTube channel and they can hear those thoughts later. I'm all over the place a little bit. You know, I've got thoughts that go in a lot of different directions. What are your reflections on our mission after the last several weeks?
Yeah, well, thank you. For one, addressing the issue at the top and asking what, my personal reflections are. I would be lying if I didn't say that the last 2 weeks have been extremely hard. Witnessing the murder of George Floyd, before that, Breonna Taylor, and Ahmaud Arbery, having those murders happen back to back to back, all while dealing with the COVID crisis and, being stuck in our homes and not being able to see friends and family like we like. It's been hard. And, one of the things that does give me a bit of solace is the work that we do at Common Cause. I came to this work because I knew that in order to make real change, we have to change the political climate, and we have to change, structural reform, change the structure of our democracy, and make sure that people that don't traditionally have voices have a voice in our democracy. And that's why I'm proud of the work that Common Cause does. And it's more than just voting. I mean, a lot of folks right now, I'll share that I posted a post on a Blackout, on Blackout Tuesday, that said, Black vote, and I got responses from folks in my community that said, voting doesn't matter. And that is the tone of this movement. Folks have been marginalized so much that they don't feel like their vote matters, and that these institutions are working for them. And that is a part of what I am hoping, and Common Cause is hoping, that we can change. Now, we do have a lot of work to do to be better allies, assuring that we are working not just for structural change, but for practices that promote the lives of Black folks, because we can change the system, but if we don't have the right to live, I mean, that is problem number one. We have to feel like we have the right to live. So I'll stop there, but that's just a few of my thoughts moving forward.
Yeah, I mean, I think about public financing of elections. It sounds so boring. I mean, just those words sound boring. And yet, right? So, for example, we've been working on the possibility of bringing a voucher system to Oakland, which, again, more boring words. But fundamentally, the idea is that in the city of Oakland, where I live, 93% of dollars donated to Oakland candidates by Oakland residents come from less than 1% of the city's population.
Wow.
And that 1% lives in disproportionately wealthy, disproportionately white areas in the Oakland Hills, right? And if you give every registered voter in Oakland 4 $25 vouchers that they can donate to candidates or to a party or to a campaign, now all of a sudden communities that have had zero discretionary income to actually make their voices heard through the contributing process can lift up their voices and have something to say about the selection of candidates and supporting candidates. And candidates now have a reason to go knock doors in every street in East Oakland or every street in West Oakland, communities that some politicians, definitely not all politicians, but some politicians just choose to ignore because they can do fundraising more effectively in the hills, right? Mm-hmm. It is a way of lifting up the voices of communities that feel disempowered and who look at the political system and say, how the hell am I supposed to ever have any impact on that? I'm opting out. So that's all that is to say, just off the top, it sounds so boring. But the purpose, right, is to build a democracy that hears everybody and brings in communities that have either been left out or specifically frozen out.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Anyway, it's been hard. Thank you for sharing your thoughts.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Jonathan, for bringing this up.
Yeah, of course. Well, all right. We should. I guess we should take questions. We should take questions from the audience. And we have one question. Keshia, how can people find out the response rate to the census in their specific area, their town, their city, their state?
Yeah, so if you go to CUNY Hard to Count Maps.us, it will pull up a map of the entire country. And it's color coded, starting from like dark orange to a really deep navy blue. So if you keep zooming in into that map, and you can zoom in on your community, your census, down to the census tract level, you can see how folks in your community are responding. I will say that the trends tend to be that, and if you live in a major city, response rates are lower, but so the suburbs around major cities tend to be a lot higher. You're
gonna have to, so first of all, thank you for that.
Yeah.
You're gonna have to explain what CUNY is, because out here on the West Coast, we don't really interact with CUNY or know it very well.
Yeah, I mean, it's just a college, City College of New York.
Yeah, City University of New York.
Yeah, City University of New York.
It's like the UC or the CSU of New York State. Just to put it in terms the Californians out here are gonna know. Wait, so give us that website one more time.
Let me make sure that I'm getting it right.
Yeah. The data tools that are available now with Census are so rich, and they allow you to really, really drill down to figure out exactly what's going on in your community. Yeah,
it is Census Hard to Count Maps 2020.us. Census Hard to Count Maps 2020.us.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing that. And One viewer wants to know, do we think an undercount, you should probably define what an undercount is. I don't know if we use that term at this point.
Sure.
Do you think an undercount is here already, and are we going to end up with an undercount in the 2020 census?
Do I think an undercount is here already? So what we have seen, as if we're just talking about self-response rates, we do know that folks that are experiencing poverty, folks that come from majority Black, Hispanic, Asian census tracts are being undercounted right now. However, with the Census Bureau extending operations until October, we know that that is the opportunity for those folks to be counted in the census. We know that we cannot have a census without door-to-door enumeration. If door-to-door enumeration is not possible, then we can't use numbers from the census. So we are very much hopeful that in-person enumeration will be able to happen. Right now, the Census Bureau has opened up all but one of its census offices that are across the country. They have about 248 offices across the country. So those operations are happening. They're also doing what's called update leave operations right now, which is where they drop off census packets to rural communities, and that is about 73% of the way complete. But the Census Bureau's in-person operations, where you'll see folks knocking on doors, is supposed to begin around August 11th. And end around October 31st.
So let me use this as a moment to share a couple of things that we're working on in California. So that delay of census processes, so the census takers, enumerators, traditionally are in the field much earlier. And they're being pushed back this time such that we're actually going to complete the count around October, which is many months later than before, which means the Census Bureau then needs more months to release redistricting data to the states. So in California, we anticipate that redistricting data will be made available July, August of 2021. And our constitutional deadline for completing our state redistricting process is mid-August 2021. So we're going to get data right around when the process is supposed to be done, and that's obviously a problem. So we're scrambling. We're working with a wide coalition of groups and with the state legislature to move the redistricting deadlines for both the state and for localities to adapt to the late release of census data. The state legislature is filing a petition with the state Supreme Court, actually right now, just happened, to ask the state Supreme Court to move our redistricting deadlines back, and Common Cause is going to file an amicus brief, basically co-signing and saying, as the independent, nonpartisan entity that helped create our Citizens Redistricting Commission, we're letting you know the legislature is not up to monkey business. They're not trying to fiddle with things. They're not trying to skew this in favor of incumbents in any way. We vetted this and we know it's a good idea. So that's one thing that we're working on. We've also got a question about the voucher program in Oakland and whether there's any information about that. And I'll just share that right now there isn't. We worked on that with a handful of groups, including MapLight, based out of Berkeley. They shine light on money in politics. We worked on it with Bay Rising, which is a coalition of community-rooted organizations in the Bay Area, with Asian Americans Advancing Justice Asian Law Caucus, with ACE, with Labor. There's a number of groups that were involved. And we have formed that. Oh, and the ACLU of Northern California was very intimately involved. And in fact, led this entity called BAPEC, the Bay Area Political Equality Collaborative, or Political Equity Collaborative. I got to nail that down. Anyway, California Common Cause is now leading BAPEC, and we're working to build a coalition behind public financing. We talked about earlier how important it is to communities that have historically been left out of power or locked out of power those communities are very unlikely to know much about public financing because we as a reform movement haven't sold it to them. We as government reformers have not taken the time to go speak with and work with and be allies to communities of color, low-income communities, and so on, and to explain the value of public financing. And so we're hoping to build a coalition behind public financing in the Bay Area that actually looks like the Bay Area. And so anyway, that's one of our goals. And over time, there will be opportunities to get involved and to learn more. Unfortunately, that isn't available right now. Okay, we're at 12:45. We went an hour last time and we said we were only going to go half an hour today. Clearly that didn't work. But let's wrap it up. Keshia, I want to thank you so much for being with us. I know that talking about census and talking about redistricting and talking about the work that we do can sometimes be a shelter from experiencing the pain of the world. And so thank you for going there with me and talking for a little bit about this moment. I appreciate it. Thanks for being our guest.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. This was a great conversation. Thank you, Jonathan.
All right. Well, tune in next time, folks. Next Wednesday at noon, we'll have another guest from the democracy space, and follow us on social media, Facebook or Twitter, in order to get information about who we're bringing on and how you can join us. Thanks so much.